Condemned Criminal Origins is a realistic and heartwarming portrayal of the nation's homeless population and the struggles that they must endure, including starvation, exposure, mutation, demonic forces, and violence from superhuman FBI agents. Released as a launch title for the Xbox 360, Condemned promised to revolutionize the horror and FPS genres and establish a new heavyweight franchise that would span multiple games, a movie, and graphic novel adaptations. It got one sequel 3 years later, and the series has been AWOL since. It may not have reached that original lofty ambition, but its unique setting and violent, innovative combat system did succeed in making it one of the most fondly remembered titles of the 7th generation and secured it a loyal cult following that remains to this day. That's what we're diving into today, so clean off your forensic equipment and ready those rusty pipes, because from here on out, we are truly By the middle part of the first decade of the 21st century, the gaming industry had reached a point where the space had begun to see the establishment of several individual studios as the powerhouses of certain genres. Blizzard and Microsoft were the big names on the block for strategy games. BioWare had established themselves as the premier developers of RPGs from the West, and Square Enix the premier developers of RPGs from the East. Ubisoft and Nintendo were competing for dominance in the world of 3D platformers, and Capcom had effectively become the face of survival horror. Within the space dedicated specifically to first-person shooters, there were three main studios that had asserted their dominance, those being id Software, 3D Realms, and Monolith Productions. Monolith exploded onto the scene in 1997 with Blood, a horror-themed shooter on the Build engine that was a success that gained a rabid cult following. Following this, they released a string of mostly successful and acclaimed follow-ups, including No One Lives Forever, Shogo, and Fear. We're going to ignore Blood too. Many of the developers working at the studio wanted to make something different, however, a title that was stylistically unique from both the games that they had previously made, as well as that of their colleagues at other dev houses. Alongside this, Monolith wanted to introduce new gameplay innovations into the genre of the first-person game, with the staff deciding that one of the key features missing from other games in the field was that of a robust melee combat system. This led to a retooling of an existing project that was in development titled The Dark. Originally envisioned as a paranormal detective story where the player made use of spells and firearms to dispatch demons and cult members, the project was reworked into something with a focus on brutal melee combat with improvised weapons and a more grounded story that contained traces of the paranormal, but mostly put it in the realms of things seen and heard but not understood. Inspired by films like Seven and The Silence of the Lambs, Monolith set about crafting a world of horror and fear that was unique compared to other games. Rather than being set in an isolated region where there was no hope of rescue, Condemned traps the player in a rundown and decaying urban metropolis, where anything goes, no one cares, and extreme violence is the norm. You get the distinct impression that in this city, it's not that no one can hear a scream, it's that they don't give a shit that you're screaming. Another thing separating Condemned from its contemporaries, and probably the thing that it's most remembered for, is the combat. Diverging heavily from the fast-paced run-and-gun gameplay of the other entries in the genre, this game has an almost exclusive focus on melee combat. Guns exist, you can find them and use them, but they're hard to come by and come with at most one mag that drains fast. Instead, most of the time, you're going to be making use of various objects scattered around the environment that were never intended to be used as weapons. Stuff like pipes ripped from the wall, pieces of 2x4, and pieces of rebar that have fallen from the ceiling make up the majority of your arsenal. To make use of this improvisational set of weapons, you engage with your enemies in a simplistic combat system that still has a pretty good amount of depth to it. The only two things you can do in this game really are hit people and block attacks, but the enemy behavior has enough complexity to it that you really have to think on your feet in order to make the most effective use of these two abilities. A really smart detail that the developers implemented with regards to the combat is the fighting style of your enemies. Like I said earlier, Condemned drops the fantastical setting of most games for the true eldritch horror that is Cleveland, so a vast majority of the enemy roster lacks any formal combat training. The enemies attack you in erratic, frenzied ways. Form and style are not a concern here. It's all about hitting the motherfucker in front of you as hard as you can with as big an object as you can. Street fighting at its most pure and brutal. That's not to say the enemies are stupid, because as far as hostile NPCs go in video games, these assholes are actually really smart. They hide behind walls to try and ambush you, they fake attacks in order to get you to mess up the timing on your block, and they even run away if they detect they aren't going to win in order to either try and get the jump on you or find a more dangerous weapon. This all gives the combat in the game a very distinct kind of ferocity that I don't think I've really seen replicated in any game other than the sequel. The developers said that in designing this combat system, they sought not to make something that was smooth and fluid, but instead raw and primal, which I think has been a huge factor in why this game is so memorable. For a bit of personal history, Condemned was actually one of the reasons I originally even wanted an Xbox 360 back in the day. I first heard about it on a 360 preview disc that I got from GameStop, and I was floored by the demo video and accompanying dev diary. The whole melee combat approach really fascinated me, and my stupid kid brain thought that would decrease my parents' potential hesitation to buy it for me if they knew that you weren't shooting people like in Doom. It never occurred to me that a game where you beat people to death instead probably wasn't that much more attractive to them. In the end though, I actually never ended up getting this game, despite it being one of my most anticipated titles for the new system. My parents never actually refused to get it for me, I just never got it because there were a lot of other games coming out at that period that ended up diverting more of my attention. I got the sequel a few months after that came out and really enjoyed that one, but that's a topic for another video. With regards to the original game, I didn't actually own it until I think 2017, where I got it for free as part of some bundle of Sega games that they were giving out for free for some reason. Oh yeah, this game was published by Sega. Weird, huh? Wonder if it shares a universe with Sonic or Yakuza. Well, anyway, that was a few years ago, and you know the drill by now. I didn't actually play the damn thing until I finally got around to doing it for a video last week. So here we are, 18 years after the game was released, I finally got around to giving the game a run-through. This was one of my most anticipated games back in the day, one of the reasons I even got a 360 in the first place, so what did I think of it? I thought it was pretty damn good. Yeah, I bet you were expecting me to shit on it, huh? Well, I'm someone who likes to enjoy video games, so it's pretty easy to please me for the most part. With that being said, I think Condemned is legitimately a really good game that's more than earned its reputation as a cult hit of the early 7th generation. Before I go hardcore into the story section of the video, wait, that's the exact opposite of what I meant. Before I go hardcore into the opinion section of the video, let's get a story summary out of the way. Condemned is set in a fictional American city that's basically just a generic stand-in for every rundown urban shithole across the nation. I don't think it's supposed to be inspired by any specific locale, though I think I read somewhere that the devs were vaguely inspired by Seattle. Wherever it is, the city has fallen on some pretty hard times. The rate of violent crime has begun to skyrocket, with assaults and murders occurring on a near-hourly basis, and more affected areas of the city nearly erupting into war zones as riots become commonplace. The city's homeless population is evolving into hordes of frenzied aggressors, and both the police and the city's government are powerless to stop the upsurge in crime. Hell, in-game documents indicate that even the cops are getting more violent, with rates of police brutality and domestic violence committed by officers shooting up as well. In addition to this, a strange phenomenon has started to affect the city's avian life as well. Birds all around the city are literally falling from the sky with their brains imploding and killing them mid-flight. Many of the people living in poor and destitute districts are starting to mutate into something less than human, and both the town and the surrounding area are afflicted with not one, but multiple vicious serial killers. This brings us to the main character, Ethan Thomas. He's a veteran FBI agent with a largely redacted background file and a voice actor who was in Heroes. He's a slightly unstable investigator who's had several of his recent cases go cold, and he's fairly confident that all of the various societal issues plaguing the city are connected. At the start of the game, he gets called to investigate the latest work of a killer he's investigating, a dude who strangles women and then poses them with mannequins that the press calls the matchmaker. At the scene, he encounters a strange man who quickly becomes the prime suspect, tries to catch him, fucks up, the other two cops with him get shot with his gun, cue the real star of the story. Now Thomas is on the run, hunted by his former colleagues and trying to catch the man who framed him in order to prove his innocence. In the course of trying to prove that you didn't kill those two guys, you kill 1,000 other guys, investigate crime scenes, and lose your fucking mind. Over the game's story, you slowly get a bigger picture painted for you that there's indeed more than meets the eye to the recent crime wave, and Ethan soon finds himself in the center of a tangling web of different parties all trying to pursue their own unclear agendas. I saw an article that said that Condemned probably has one of the most vague stories ever told in a horror game, and I think that's pretty true. There's a lot of story beats and stuff that's hinted at, but very little is explicitly told to the player, and almost nothing is actually explained. You know about as much about what's going on at the end of the game as you do at the start, which I think helps enhance the game's mysterious and foreboding atmosphere. The closest you really get to an answer to anything is that some kind of cult or cult-like organization is playing a role in the rise in violence, which is somehow connected to these strange pieces of metal that you find all throughout the game. There's a definite sense that something paranormal is going on, with the frequent reality-bending hallucinations that your character has, the mass psychosis, the game's more inhuman enemies, and the last 2 levels where you actually face off against the cult members themselves. The cult guys are basically the only real bosses that the game has, and they fight completely differently than everyone else. Unlike all the other dudes you bludgeon to death over the course of the game, these guys actually know how to fight, making use of some martial art that has a name I can't pronounce. I always wondered what was the point of all those weird looking flourishes that those monks do, but after this game I kinda get it now. That shit is hard to deal with, so I guess this game was also an educational experience. This all culminates in the last boss fight of the game, where you go up against an enemy referred to as the Dark Primary, which is supposed to be the being behind the rise in violence. He's a deformed dude who has all this metal stuck into his body and wields a bow staff that he uses to beat the living shit out of you. He's a top shelf martial artist, but at this point in the game, so was I confronted him in one-on-one combat and bested him in a fight that required all of my talents and skills to be used to their full potential. Some people really don't like the introduction of supernatural elements into the game's story and lore, but I actually thought it was really cool. It gives the whole thing this much more sinister and evil vibe to me. The thought that it's not just random violence and poverty at work here, but an actively malignant force that does away with our standard ideas about the course of society, this vague sense of an all-powerful evil that can degrade our social structure without us even knowing about it for reasons that are ultimately unclear. The sequel amps up a lot of the supernatural elements and makes them much more explicit to a mixed effect, making the story more intriguing in some areas and less in others, but like I said, that's a whole nother video. The biggest issue I had with this game doesn't actually have to do with gameplay or story, but of course the performance. For the most part, the game runs flawlessly on modern systems, but there is one big issue that you have to deal with. For whatever reason, the game's engine does this weird thing where it starts out running fine, but then degrades very quickly after about 5 minutes of playing, where the frame rate gets so low that it's almost unplayable.
Thomas, I don't got all day here. Let's get a move on.
At first, I thought this was just a bad boot, so I restarted the game, and it initially seemed to have fixed the issue. Yeah, so apparently what the issue is, and I swear I'm not bullshitting here, is that the game doesn't like the drivers for a lot of modern Logitech stuff, and I have a Logitech mouse, so that was blasting the frame rate for some reason. To fix this, you have to go into your device manager and disable all the HID functionality for your attached devices, so like your mouse and keyboard and shit, which doesn't deactivate those devices. I don't really know what the fuck it does, but it worked, and I could play through the rest of the game with no issues. Yeah, computers are kind of weird and I hate them. I did a semester at a local college for network maintenance and engineering, and thank fucking God I noped out that shit as fast as possible. Alright, Condemned Criminal Origins, ladies and gentlemen. It's a really good game with a great atmosphere, spooky story, and a really fun and unique combat system that not really any game has tried to replicate since. I do plan to do a review on the second one eventually, but it's kind of complicated since it never got a PC release and I no longer have a working 360 to play my copy on. I don't think I even still have my old copy, now that I think about it. Anyway, I definitely recommend this game, especially if you're into shooters, horror games, or Monolith. You can't go wrong with this one. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go get into a fight with the homeless guy who lives in a shed down the road. Hey everybody, if you made it this far into the video, I just want to say thanks, it means a whole lot. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all your standard YouTube outro stuff, and I just want to say a big thanks to the first patron over at the Patreon, Spec Teams 1 Slingshots. Thanks for that, and I'll see y'all in the next video. Goodbye.